Some people only realize the truth when it's already too late. The morning sun stretched across the dry fields of Willow Creek Farm, casting long shadows over the quiet land as a soft breeze moved through the tall grass, carrying the faint scent of earth and distant pine. Evelyn Carter stood at the edge of her porch, her hands resting calmly on the wooden railing, her eyes scanning the horizon with a focus that went far beyond the simple life she appeared to live. To anyone passing by, she was just another woman tending to her land, someone who lived a quiet, unremarkable life far from the noise of the world. But quiet didn't mean unaware. Every sound, every movement, every shift in the air, it all mattered. She tilted her head slightly as a distant engine broke the stillness, the low rumble of vehicles growing louder with each passing second. Evelyn didn't move, didn't react. She simply watched. Within moments, dust began to rise along the dirt road leading to her property, tires crunching against gravel as a convoy of black SUVs approached, slowing only when they reached the edge of her land. The lead vehicle stopped first, followed by the others in a line that stretched across the narrow road. Doors opened. Heavy boots hit the ground. Men stepped out. 10, maybe more, each carrying themselves with a confidence that came from numbers, from force, from the belief that they were in control. At the front stood Brandon Hayes, his posture rigid, his gaze sharp as he surveyed the farm with a mix of irritation and satisfaction, like a man inspecting something he was about to claim. His eyes eventually landed on Evelyn, still standing on the porch, still calm. "This the place," one of the men muttered. Brandon smirked slightly. "Looks like it," he replied, adjusting his jacket as he took a step forward. "Didn't expect much," another added under his breath. Evelyn heard every word. She said nothing. Brandon raised his voice, loud enough to carry across the yard. "You live here alone?" His tone carried a quiet challenge, a question that didn't really expect an answer, just confirmation of what he already believed. Evelyn's eyes met his, steady and unshaken. The wind picked up slightly, brushing past her as if the land itself leaned in to listen. "That depends," she said finally, her voice even, calm, and deliberate. Brandon's smirk faded just a little, replaced by something more curious. "On what?" he asked. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the barn behind her, then back at the men gathered in front of her property. A brief silence followed, thick and heavy, the kind that stretched just long enough to make people uncomfortable. Then she spoke again, softer this time. "On what you came here to do." A few of the men exchanged looks, unsure how to read her. Brandon let out a short laugh, shaking his head as he took another step closer. "You talk like you got something to protect," he said. Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "Everyone does." The wind shifted again, carrying the sound of something metallic being adjusted somewhere out of sight. Brandon didn't notice. None of them did. Not yet. Because what they saw was a quiet woman on a quiet farm, and what they failed to see was everything else. The air felt different after those words, as if the land itself had shifted its attention toward the quiet woman standing on the porch. Brandon Hayes narrowed his eyes, studying her more closely now, the faint smirk on his face slowly fading into something more cautious. Around him, his men adjusted their stances, their earlier confidence settling into a quieter, more uncertain tension. They had expected fear, hesitation, maybe even resistance, but what they were facing now was something else entirely. Evelyn Carter remained still, her posture relaxed yet deliberate, her gaze steady as it moved across each person standing on her land. She did not rush. She did not show any sign of panic. Instead, she observed, as if she were gathering information rather than reacting to a threat. "You are alone out here?" Brandon asked again, this time more controlled, his voice losing some of its earlier arrogance. Evelyn let a moment pass before responding, her tone calm and measured. "Being alone does not mean being unprepared." A few of the men exchanged subtle glances, their confidence wavering just enough to be noticeable. One of them shifted his weight, glancing toward the barn in the distance, as if trying to read the situation beyond what was visible. The quiet stretched again, heavier this time, filled with unspoken questions and rising uncertainty. Brandon let out a short breath, forcing a slight grin as he tried to regain control of the moment. "You got a lot of attitude for someone standing in the middle of nowhere," he said, taking another step forward, closing the distance between himself and the porch. Evelyn did not step back. She simply watched him approach. Confidence is not the same as attitude, she replied. The wind moved again, brushing past them, carrying the faint creak of wood from the barn behind her. Brandon's eyes flicked in that direction for just a second before returning to her. "What exactly are you protecting out here?" he asked, his tone sharpening again, testing her, probing for any weakness. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged. "Peace," she said. "And what happens when someone tries to take that away?" A faint smile crossed her face, subtle and controlled, but there was something in it that made several of the men straighten unconsciously. Brandon studied her for a long moment, his instincts beginning to whisper that something was not right, though he could not yet explain why. "Then you lose it," he said, though the certainty in his voice was no longer as firm as before. Evelyn's gaze held his. "No," she said softly. "Then you realize it was never yours to take." A pause followed, a long, deliberate silence that seemed to stretch across the entire property. Somewhere behind her, a faint mechanical sound clicked, almost imperceptible, as if something unseen had just been adjusted into place. One of the men frowned slightly, shifting his focus toward the barn again, his instincts catching something his words could not explain. Brandon noticed the shift in his man's attention and frowned. "You hearing something?" he asked. The man hesitated, then shook his head. "Just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked certainty. Evelyn's eyes remained locked on Brandon, her calm unbroken, her presence unwavering. She took a slow breath, as if measuring the moment, then spoke again, her voice lower now, almost blending with the wind itself. "You should leave," she said. Brandon laughed under his breath, though it carried less weight than before. "Or what?" he asked. The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the wind swept across the open field and a distant shadow shifted ever so slightly behind the barn window, unnoticed by everyone except the woman who had already seen it all. The silence that followed Evelyn Carter's words seemed to stretch longer than anyone was comfortable with, as if the entire property had paused to listen for something that had not yet revealed itself. Brandon Hayes held his ground, but the ease in his posture was gone now, replaced by a quiet tension that crept into his shoulders. His eyes scanned Evelyn again, slower this time, searching for something he could use to regain control of the situation. Around him, his men began to shift their weight, their earlier confidence replaced by a subtle unease that they tried to hide behind forced expressions and controlled breathing. Evelyn remained exactly where she was, her presence steady, her focus unwavering. She did not glance around nervously, did not rush to explain herself, and did not attempt to prove anything. Instead, she waited, her calm carrying a weight that none of them could ignore. "You keep saying that," Brandon said, his voice lower now, like it means something. Evelyn studied him for a moment, then responded, her tone measured and clear. "It does mean something. It means you are still deciding whether to leave or make a mistake." A small ripple moved through the group at those words, a few of the men exchanging uncertain looks. One of them, standing slightly behind Brandon, tightened his grip on his jacket as his gaze flickered once more toward the barn. There was something about the stillness of that structure that no longer felt natural. Brandon noticed the hesitation in his own men and frowned, forcing a step forward as he tried to reclaim the moment. "We do not take directions from people like you," he said, though his voice lacked the sharp edge it once had. Evelyn's gaze remained fixed on him. "People like me," she repeated quietly, as if testing the weight of the words. "And what exactly does that mean to you?" Brandon hesitated for the first time since arriving. It was brief, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. His jaw tightened slightly as he searched for a response, but before he could answer, a faint metallic sound drifted from the direction of the barn. It was soft, distant, but unmistakable. One of the men turned his head sharply. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice lower than before. Brandon's irritation flickered. "Hear what?" he snapped, but even as he spoke, his eyes shifted toward the same direction. Evelyn did not look back. She did not need to. "You are standing on land that does not belong to you," she said calmly. "Every step you take here is a decision you are making." Brandon let out a short, dismissive breath, but the confidence behind it was thinning. "You talk like you have authority out here," he said, though the words carried less certainty than before. Evelyn's expression softened only slightly, not in weakness, but in clarity. Authority is not given by force, she replied. It is recognized through understanding. The wind moved again, this time slightly stronger, passing between them and carrying a faint echo of something hidden, something unseen. One of the men took a half step back without realizing it, his instincts reacting before his thoughts could catch up. Brandon turned toward him, frustrated. "What is wrong with you?" he demanded. The man shook his head, forcing a small laugh. "Nothing. Just thought I saw something." Brandon stared at him for a moment, then shook his head in annoyance before turning his attention back to Evelyn. But something had shifted. Not in her, but in the air around them. The certainty he had arrived with was beginning to erode, replaced by something far less comfortable. Evelyn finally moved, just slightly, shifting her stance as she placed one hand lightly on the railing beside her. "You have two choices," she said quietly. "You can turn around and leave, or you can stay long enough to learn why that would have been the better decision." The words lingered in the space between them, carried by the wind across the open land. And somewhere beyond the visible horizon, something unseen adjusted its position, as if waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. Brandon Hayes stared at Evelyn Carter for a long moment after her words settled into the air, his expression tightening as the weight of the situation began to shift in a way he did not expect. The confidence that had carried him onto this land was still there, but it no longer felt absolute. Around him, his men were no longer as unified in their stance. Small, almost invisible signs of uncertainty began to appear in their posture, in the way their eyes moved, in the subtle adjustments of their breathing. The wind continued to move across the open field, brushing past them and carrying with it a quiet tension that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Evelyn did not rush the moment. She let it unfold naturally, her presence steady, her eyes never leaving Brandon. It was not aggression that defined her, but control, a deep and unwavering sense of awareness that made it clear she understood far more than she was saying. Brandon finally exhaled sharply, breaking the silence with a short, dismissive sound. "You keep talking like you are in charge here," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, studying him with a calm, almost patient expression. "I am not in charge," she replied. "I am aware." The distinction lingered between them, subtle but significant. One of Brandon's men shifted again, his attention drifting toward the barn for a third time. This time, Brandon noticed. "What is it?" he demanded, his patience beginning to thin. The man hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing. It is just quiet." Brandon frowned, clearly irritated by the answer. "It is supposed to be quiet," he said, but even as he spoke, his tone lacked its earlier certainty. Evelyn's gaze followed the direction of the man's glance, just briefly, before returning to Brandon. "Quiet is not the same as empty," she said softly. The words seemed to settle into the group, adding another layer of tension to the already strained atmosphere. Brandon took a slow step forward, stopping just a few feet from the base of the porch now. "You have been out here alone too long," he said, attempting to regain control through dominance. "People start thinking they are untouchable." Evelyn did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked at him with a calm that bordered on unsettling. "Untouchable is not the same as protected," she said. The air seemed to shift again. The wind slowed, almost as if holding its breath. In the distance, a faint sound echoed, barely audible, but enough to make one of the men turn his head sharply. It was subtle, almost like a distant click, followed by stillness. Brandon caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. "Stay focused," he ordered, though his voice was now slightly tighter. He was beginning to lose his grip on the situation, and he knew it, even if he refused to admit it. Evelyn slowly lowered her hand from the railing, her posture changing just enough to suggest something had shifted, though it was difficult to define what. Her expression remained composed, but her eyes held a deeper focus now, as if something within her had just aligned into place. "You came here looking for something," she said, her voice calm but firm. Brandon narrowed his eyes. "And what makes you think that?" Evelyn paused for a brief moment before answering. "Because people like you do not come to places like this without expecting something." The word struck closer than Brandon liked. He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. His gaze flickered, and for the first time since arriving, he did not have a quick response. Behind Evelyn, the barn stood still, its presence now feeling less like part of the background and more like something intentional, something waiting. The group remained locked in place, the distance between certainty and uncertainty narrowing with every passing second. Evelyn took a slow breath, then spoke one final time before the moment could break. "You are not the first to make that mistake." And in that moment, as the wind carried her words across the land, something unseen adjusted itself once more, preparing for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. The tension that had been building across the land did not fade. Instead, it settled deeper, like something that had finally found its place and refused to move. Brandon Hayes stood still now, his earlier aggression replaced with a quiet, controlled unease that he could no longer fully hide. His eyes remained locked on Evelyn Carter, studying her in a way that suggested he was no longer certain of what he was facing. Around him, his men had gone quiet, their movements slower, their confidence fractured into something less defined. No one spoke. No one rushed forward. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, as if waiting for something to happen. Evelyn remained on the porch, her posture unchanged, her attention steady. She was not looking at them the way they were looking at her. She was observing, analyzing, understanding. There was a difference, and it was becoming more apparent with every passing second. Brandon finally broke the silence with a short breath, forcing a small shake of his head. "You are good at this," he said, his tone carrying a mix of irritation and reluctant acknowledgement. "Whatever this is." Evelyn's expression did not change. "This is not something you do," she replied calmly. "This is something you learn." The words lingered in the air, quiet but firm, and for a moment, no one responded. One of the men shifted again, his attention drawn to the barn, then to the fields beyond, as if searching for something he could not quite identify. Another man tightened his grip on his jacket, his breathing slightly uneven. Brandon noticed the small cracks forming in his group, and it only increased his frustration. "Enough of this," he said, his voice sharpening again as he tried to reclaim control. "We are not here for a conversation." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, as if acknowledging the statement. "Then what are you here for?" she asked. The question landed cleanly, forcing Brandon to pause. It was a simple question, but it carried weight, because it required an answer he was not prepared to give honestly. He took a step forward, stopping just short of the edge of the porch. "We already know what we came for," he said, though the certainty in his voice was thinner now. Evelyn studied him for a moment, then spoke softly. "No, you do not." The exchange shifted something in the atmosphere again. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to change the rhythm of the moment. The quiet was no longer empty. It was active, filled with unspoken awareness. In the distance, a faint sound echoed once more, subtle but deliberate, like a signal that went unnoticed by most but not by all. Evelyn's gaze flickered briefly toward the horizon, then returned to Brandon. Her composure never broke, but something within her had sharpened, as if she had confirmed a detail she had already suspected. Brandon exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that betrayed more frustration than he intended to show. "You are standing there acting like you have this all figured out," he said. Evelyn responded without hesitation. "I do not need to figure it out. I only need to observe." That answer seemed to unsettle him further. He frowned, studying her again, this time with a different kind of focus. Not dismissive, not aggressive, calculating. Something about her no longer fit the simple explanation he had tried to apply when he first arrived. The men behind him began to feel it too. The confidence that had brought them here was no longer holding them together in the same way. There was no immediate threat visible, yet the feeling of being watched, of being measured, had grown stronger than any direct confrontation. Evelyn shifted her weight slightly, her voice steady as she spoke again. "You are standing on land that has already been measured." Brandon narrowed his eyes. "Measured by who?" Evelyn paused for just a moment before answering. "By the consequences of the choices made here." The words settled heavily, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. And in that moment, something in the distance moved again, not loudly, not suddenly, but with purpose. The stillness that followed was no longer empty. It was waiting, as if the next decision would determine everything that came after. The air felt heavier now, not because of noise or movement, but because of what was no longer being said. Brandon Hayes stood with his feet planted firmly on the ground, yet something about his posture had changed. The confidence that once defined him had not disappeared completely, but it had fractured into something less certain, something more fragile. His men remained behind him, quieter than before, their attention divided between Evelyn Carter and the space around them, as if expecting something unseen to reveal itself at any moment. Evelyn stood on the porch as she had since the beginning, her expression calm, her posture composed, her presence unwavering. She was not reacting to them in the way they expected. She was watching, and more importantly, she was understanding. Brandon let out a slow breath, forcing himself to maintain control as he spoke. "You keep saying things like you know something we do not," he said, his tone measured but no longer confident. Evelyn did not respond immediately. She simply observed him for a moment, her gaze steady, as if she were weighing not just his words, but the intention behind them. "I do," she said finally, her voice calm and certain. The simplicity of the answer unsettled him more than any challenge or confrontation could have. One of the men behind Brandon shifted his stance, his attention drifting once again toward the barn, then to the distant field beyond. This time he spoke. "There is something off about this place," he said quietly. Brandon turned his head slightly. "Explain," he demanded. The man hesitated, searching for words. "I do not." "No," he said. "It just feels watched." Brandon frowned, clearly irritated by the lack of clarity, but even he could not completely dismiss the feeling that had begun to settle in. Evelyn's gaze moved briefly toward the man who had spoken, then returned to Brandon. "You are not being watched," she said softly. "You are being observed." The distinction was subtle, but it carried weight. Observed meant measured. Observed meant understood. Observed meant that something had already been decided, even if they had not yet realized it. Brandon took a step forward, his patience thinning. "We came here for a reason," he said, "and we are not leaving until we get what we came for." Evelyn nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. "Then you should be certain of what that reason is," she replied. The wind moved across the land again, slower this time, carrying with it a stillness that felt deliberate. In the distance, a faint shift could be heard, almost like fabric brushing against wood, or a subtle adjustment of something not meant to be seen. One of the men stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he tried to locate the source of the sound. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice lower than before. Brandon did not answer immediately. His focus remained on Evelyn, but his awareness had expanded. He was no longer just looking at her. He was trying to see everything at once. Evelyn noticed the change. "You are beginning to pay attention," she said. Brandon's jaw tightened slightly. "I have been paying attention," he replied. Evelyn shook her head once, slowly. "No," she said. "You have been looking." The words settled into the space between them, quiet but deliberate. Looking and paying attention were not the same. One was passive. The other required understanding. Brandon felt the difference, even if he did not fully accept it. He took another step forward, closer to the porch, his eyes narrowing as he searched her expression for something he could use. "What are you really doing out here?" he asked. Evelyn met his gaze without hesitation. "Living," she said. The answer was simple, but it carried a deeper meaning that none of them could ignore. Behind her, the barn remained still, yet no longer felt empty. The field stretched outward in every direction, quiet and open, but no longer uncertain. The land itself seemed aware, as if it had been prepared long before any of them arrived. Brandon exhaled slowly, his frustration rising again, but this time mixed with something else, something closer to doubt. "You are not what we expected," he admitted reluctantly. Evelyn did not smile. She did not react with satisfaction. She simply responded with quiet certainty. "No," she said. "I am not." And in that moment, the balance between them shifted once more, not through action, but through understanding, as the silence deepened and whatever had been waiting in the distance drew just a little closer. The moment stretched, fragile and unbroken, as Evelyn Carter and Brandon Hayes stood facing each other across the quiet space between the porch and the open field. Nothing moved at first, yet everything felt like it was about to. Brandon's breathing was slower now, controlled, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the effort it took to maintain it. His men stood behind him in a loose formation, no longer confident, no longer unified. each of them caught in their own thoughts as the atmosphere continued to shift around them. Evelyn remained still, her posture calm, her attention focused entirely on Brandon, as if she were measuring not just his presence, but his intentions. The wind moved gently across the land, brushing against the tall grass and carrying with it a quiet sense of inevitability. Brandon broke the silence first, his voice steady but lower than before. "You keep speaking like you already know how this ends," he said. Evelyn's expression did not change. "I do not speak about endings," she replied. "I speak about consequences." The words settled between them, heavier than anything else that had been said so far. One of Brandon's men shifted again, this time more noticeably, his eyes narrowing as he stared toward the barn. Another followed his gaze, then another, until the attention of the group began to drift away from Evelyn for just a moment. Brandon noticed immediately. "Eyes on me," he said firmly, bringing their focus back to the present. But even as he spoke, his own attention was divided. Something about the barn had changed. Not in appearance, but in perception. It no longer felt like just a structure. It felt like something that had been waiting. Evelyn saw the shift in their attention and said nothing. She allowed it to happen as if it were part of a process she had already completed in her mind. Brandon let out a slow breath, then spoke again, this time with a hint of frustration. "You have been out here long enough to think you understand what we are dealing with," he said. Evelyn responded without hesitation. "Understanding does not come from being here long," she said. "It comes from knowing what to look for." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Brandon's jaw tightened slightly. "And what exactly should we be looking for?" he asked. Evelyn paused for just a moment, then replied, "You should be looking for what you missed." The statement lingered, and for the first time, Brandon felt a small but undeniable shift in his perception. He scanned the property again, this time more carefully. The open field, the quiet barn, the worn but well-maintained porch. Everything appeared ordinary at first glance, yet something about it no longer felt accidental. One of his men took a small step forward, squinting as he tried to focus on something in the distance. "There is something in that barn," he said quietly. Brandon turned toward him, his expression tightening. "What do you mean?" he asked. The man hesitated. "I do not know," he said, "but it does not feel empty." Evelyn remained still, but her attention shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward the same direction. Brandon noticed the change in her focus. "What is in there?" he asked, this time directly addressing her. Evelyn met his gaze. "You are asking the wrong question," she said. Brandon frowned. "Then what is the right one?" he asked. Evelyn did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked past him, toward the group standing behind him, then back again. "The right question," she said quietly, "is whether you are prepared for the answer." A long silence followed. The kind of silence that carried meaning. The kind that gave time for realization to settle in. Brandon felt it then, not as fear, but as awareness. The realization that this situation was not as simple as it appeared. The realization that they had stepped into something without fully understanding its depth. The realization that Evelyn Carter was not someone to be dismissed. The wind picked up slightly, moving across the land in a slow, deliberate motion, as if responding to something unseen. Brandon straightened his posture, trying to regain his sense of control. "Whatever you are trying to do here," he said, "it is not going to work." Evelyn's gaze remained steady. "It already has," she replied. And in that moment, as the words settled into the air, the quiet around them deepened once more, as if the land itself had confirmed what had just been said, and was now waiting for what would come next. The stillness that followed Evelyn Carter's last words did not feel empty, but complete, as if every sound, every breath, and every thought had aligned into a single moment waiting to unfold. Brandon Hayes stood frozen for just a fraction longer than he expected, the weight of the situation settling deeper into his awareness. His men behind him were no longer simply waiting. They were watching, each of them now fully aware that something about this encounter had shifted beyond their control. Evelyn remained steady, her presence calm, her focus unwavering, as though she had already accepted what was about to happen and was simply allowing the moment to reach its natural conclusion. Brandon finally exhaled, forcing a small shake of his head as he tried to push past the growing uncertainty. "You are good at creating tension," he said, his voice steady but lacking its earlier confidence. Evelyn did not respond immediately. Instead, she observed him, her eyes searching, not for fear or hesitation, but for something deeper. Tension is not created, she said softly. It is revealed. The distinction lingered in the air, subtle yet powerful, and for the first time, Brandon did not immediately respond. One of his men took a cautious step forward, his eyes fixed on the barn as a quiet realization seemed to settle in. Something is wrong, he said under his breath, though he did not yet fully understand why. Brandon turned sharply toward him. Then say what it is, he demanded. The man hesitated, his voice uncertain. I do not know, he admitted. But this does not feel like a normal farm. Evelyn's gaze shifted slightly toward the man, then returned to Brandon. It is not normal, she said. That is the point. Brandon's expression tightened, frustration returning as he tried to regain his footing in the situation. You keep speaking in circles, he said. If you have something to say, then say it. Evelyn took a slow breath, her posture unchanged, her voice calm but deliberate. I already have, she replied. The silence that followed was heavier this time, as if the land itself had absorbed the words and was now holding them in place. Brandon felt it again, that subtle but persistent sense that something had already been decided long before they arrived. He turned slightly, scanning the surroundings once more, his eyes narrowing as he searched for something that could explain the feeling that continued to grow within him. The barn, the field, the porch, everything appeared unchanged, yet nothing felt the same. One of the men stepped back without realizing it, his breathing slightly uneven as his instincts began to take over. We should reconsider this, he said quietly. Brandon's head snapped toward him. Reconsider what? He asked sharply. The man hesitated, then spoke with more certainty. This is not a place where we have the advantage. The words struck harder than expected. Brandon's jaw tightened as he processed them, but before he could respond, Evelyn spoke again, her voice cutting through the moment with quiet authority. You never had the advantage, she said. The statement hung in the air, clear and final, leaving no room for interpretation. Brandon stared at her, his expression shifting for the first time into something closer to disbelief. That is not possible, he said, though his voice no longer carried the same conviction. Evelyn's eyes remained locked on his. It is not only possible, she said, it is already true. A faint sound echoed in the distance once more, subtle but deliberate, like the final confirmation of something that had been building beneath the surface. Brandon froze, not in fear, but in realization. His men grew still behind him, their confidence now fully replaced with uncertainty. The environment itself seemed to shift, not visibly, but perceptibly, as if the balance of the moment had reached its final point. Evelyn remained exactly where she was, her presence unchanged, her control absolute, as the last remnants of Brandon's certainty began to fade into the quiet air between them. The silence that followed did not feel like an ending, but like a moment of truth finally arriving at its destination. Brandon Hayes stood still, his shoulders no longer tense with resistance, but quiet with realization. The men behind him had lowered their weapons slightly, not out of surrender, but out of uncertainty, as if their instincts had quietly shifted from action to awareness. Evelyn Carter remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, composed, steady, and fully present, as though she had been guiding the entire moment without ever raising her voice. The wind moved gently across the field, carrying with it a sense of finality that could not be ignored. Brandon looked at Evelyn, his expression now different, no longer driven by control, but by understanding that something larger had been at play from the very start. You never needed to prove anything, he said quietly, his voice stripped of its earlier authority. Evelyn responded without hesitation. No, she said. I only needed you to see. The words landed with quiet certainty, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Brandon took a slow breath, then looked back toward his men, seeing not just their uncertainty, but their awareness. They had all come here with a purpose, but now that purpose felt distant, almost irrelevant. This was never about force, Brandon said, more to himself than to anyone else. Evelyn gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Force creates reaction, she said. Truth creates change. The difference between the two settled into the space between them, clear and undeniable. One of the men stepped forward slightly, his voice cautious but sincere. Then what happens now? He asked. Evelyn turned her attention toward him, her expression calm and measured. "Now," she said, "you decide what kind of story you want to continue." Brandon exhaled slowly, absorbing her words. The tension that had defined the moment was no longer present in the same way. It had not disappeared, but it had transformed. He looked at Evelyn again, studying her, not as a threat, but as something far more complex. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice softer than before. Evelyn held his gaze. "Someone who remembers," she said. The answer was simple, yet it carried weight that could not be ignored. Brandon nodded slowly, as if something inside him had finally aligned. Around them, the atmosphere began to ease, not because the situation was resolved, but because the conflict had shifted into understanding. The men remained alert, but no longer aggressive. The balance had changed. Evelyn took a small step back toward the porch, her presence still steady, still in control, but no longer the center of confrontation. Brandon watched her, realizing that nothing about this encounter had been random. Everything had led to this exact moment, where perception itself had been challenged and reshaped. "You did not come here to fight," he said. Evelyn paused, then replied, "No, I came here to be seen." The words lingered, and in that moment, the story that had begun in tension found its resolution not in victory or defeat, but in awareness. Brandon lowered his gaze slightly, acknowledging the truth without resistance. The men behind him followed his lead, the shift complete not through force, but through understanding. Evelyn stood for a moment longer, then turned slightly toward the horizon, where the light continued to stretch across the land, steady and unbroken. The moment had passed, but its meaning remained, quiet and permanent, like a lesson that could not be undone, only remembered.